Welcome to Flipped Classroom. Today we will be looking at arguing about literature and applying critical thinking skills to literary analysis. Let's start with the concept of what is an argument. An argument is not a win-lose situation. Instead, you are persuading your audience. You're showing them how to see something from a new perspective. For example, let's take the global warming argument. You wouldn't want to have an extremist view. For an example, the alarmist who is warning about the end of the world, or the denier who's unwilling to open his or her mind that there might be a problem. Argument is also used in forms of art, such as literature, film, and painting. When you develop an argument for literature, you analyze why you view the subject the way you do. You address others who may not share your point of view. You try to persuade them that your view is worth accepting or at least makes sense. For example, in the story of An Hour, the question is posed, what killed Louise? Some people would argue that she was so thrilled that her husband returned, combined with her heart disease, the shock killed her. Other people could argue that she died of a broken heart, being so overwhelmed with disappointment that her husband returned. Whichever side you argue, as long as you have evidence, your argument is solid. Here are the elements of persuasion used in argument. First, you present the issue. That is the unsettled question. You would also present your main claim. That's your debatable answer. And in writing, we call that your thesis. There are also throughout your argument will be smaller claims, other smaller issues that have debatable answers. At this point, you would need to provide evidence. Evidence is your support for your claim. With the evidence, you apply reasoning. That is how the answer is derived. In this process, you will be making assumptions, and assumptions are existing beliefs. You will employ rhetorical appeals, such as ethos, logos, and pathos. And keep in mind always, who is your audience? Who are you trying to persuade? That will allow you to know what kind of tone or voice would be required in this argument. Let's look specifically today on inductive and deductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, you start from a very specific idea and move to general. For example, you begin with a specific observation, detect patterns in form a tentative hypothesis to test, and conclude with a new theory. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. In this case, you begin with a theory that explains an event. You form a hypothesis. Then you collect the data, information, observations to test the hypothesis that will confirm it. So in one case, you go specific to general, the other general specific. Let's apply inductive reasoning to literature. We'll use, for example, a story of An Hour. In this case, you're going to start with an observation. For example, Louise is not overly sad upon hearing about Mr. Mallard's death. Then you would look for patterns in the story. For example, her words, free, body and soul free, and her physical reaction, how she throws herself in a chair but then walks around like a goddess of victory. Then you would establish a hypothesis. This is your idea that Louise is happy that she no longer is a wife. This is debatable because some people would say she is happy. Based on this hypothesis, you could develop a general theory that being a widow in the late 19th century can be liberating due to the repression of marriage. So notice how you have a very specific observation about Louise, find patterns in the literature, develop your hypothesis, which is debatable, and then go to a broader theory. That is how you apply inductive reasoning to literature. But inductive reasoning isn't always perfect. When you are beginning with a specific example, such as penguins are black and white, then you detect a pattern. Oh, well, penguins are black and white, but so are old TV shows. They are also black and white. So you form a tentative hypothesis. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Well, that doesn't make sense. Therefore, your theory that you conclude with fails. Let's take a look at another example. All cats have 4 legs is your observation. I have 4 legs, that's the pattern, therefore I am a cat. Well, clearly this logic fails because the dog is not a cat. Unlike inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning begins with a theory that explains an event. Then you form your hypotheses. Then you collect your information and observations that will confirm your hypotheses. Let's take a closer look. Applying deductive reasoning to literature, specifically with the story of an hour. In this case, you start with a theory. The theory is being a widow in the late 19th century can be liberating due to the repression in marriage. Okay, you have this idea, and now you're going to look in the literature specifically to support your idea that Louise is happy that she no longer is a wife. You'd specifically go to the text to find patterns and observations, such as finding her words and physical reactions. That would confirm that Louise is not overly sad upon hearing of Mr. Mallard's death. But like inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning isn't always perfect. In deductive reasoning, you have to assume that the premise, that's the first statement, is true. Then you can deduce other things that have to be true. So let's take a look at the premise. This dog always barks when someone's at the door, and the dog didn't bark. Therefore, no one is at the door. Well, that's not necessarily true. There could be other reasons the dog isn't barking. So, in this case, assuming the premises is true is faulty logic. Let's take another look. Sam goes wherever Ben goes. Ben went to the library. Therefore, Sam also went to the library. Well, once again, you're assuming that the first statement, the premise, is true, and that can lead to illogical reasoning. Let's apply this to story of an hour. If your premise is that people cry when they are sad, okay, that's logical, and Louise Mallard sobbed in her bedroom upon hearing of Mr. Mallard's death, let's see if this conclusion, Louise Mallard is sad about her husband's death. Well, that's not necessarily true, because you could also prove that her crying was just one part of her emotional experience. Other parts were left out. So once again, deductive reasoning isn't always perfect. So let's review. In persuasion, you have your issue, you have your claims, your evidence, and you apply your reasoning. You'll have a choice of inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. It's all the strategy that you take to developing your argument, which will include making assumptions, employing appeals, and knowing your audience. Thank you for joining me today in Flipped Classroom.